5 common daily habits are linked in research to significantly shortened lifespans in men, and alcohol, the one most people assume tops the list, actually ranks last among them. Today, we're reviewing what the evidence says about each one, starting with the most surprising and working toward the habit most men already suspect. These 5 habits are ordered by the strength of their association with reduced lifespan in current research, not by how commonly discussed they are. This matters because several habits with stronger evidence behind them receive far less attention than alcohol specifically, despite carrying a larger measurable impact on life expectancy, according to population studies. Before continuing, a brief note: none of these 5 points are about guilt or shame. They reflect population-level research associations, not individual predictions. Each section includes what the evidence actually shows and what remains uncertain, rather than presenting every claim with equal confidence. Coming in at number 5, regular alcohol consumption. Research consistently links heavy, regular drinking with reduced life expectancy, generally estimated in the range of 2 to 3 years on average across drinkers. This average number understates the risk for men who binge drink specifically, consuming several drinks in a single sitting, where research shows the reduction can be considerably larger. Evidence level strong based on large population studies and mechanistic understanding of liver function. The liver processes roughly 1 standard drink per hour, and exceeding that pace causes cellular damage that outpaces natural repair, particularly with age, when the liver's regenerative capacity slows. Chronic heavy drinking is also linked to elevated blood pressure, disrupted sleep, and reduced testosterone over time. The practical guidance here is moderation rather than elimination for most men without a diagnosed condition. Spacing drinks, building in alcohol-free days weekly, and avoiding binge patterns specifically address the mechanisms driving this particular risk. Men with liver disease are on blood thinners or have a history of alcohol dependence should discuss any drinking pattern directly with a doctor rather than relying on general guidance. Number 4 ranks above alcohol specifically because of how broadly it affects the body. Long-term studies on men under sustained, unmanaged stress find an average reduction in life expectancy exceeding 4 years, a larger effect than alcohol shows in comparable research. The mechanism involves chronic cortisol elevation. Brief cortisol spikes are protective and normal. Sustained elevation, the kind that develops when stress becomes constant background noise rather than an occasional spike, weakens immune function, raises blood pressure, elevates blood sugar, and disrupts sleep quality even when total sleep time appears adequate. Evidence level, strong, though individual response to stress varies considerably, meaning this represents a population average rather than a fixed outcome for any specific person. Practical management doesn't require eliminating stress, which isn't realistic. Regular physical activity, maintaining genuine social connection, and building in deliberate recovery time all show research support for lowering cortisol over time. Men experiencing persistent stress alongside symptoms like chest tightness, panic, or significant sleep disruption should raise this directly with a doctor rather than managing it alone indefinitely. We're now roughly halfway through, and this is where the pattern shifts toward habits that receive considerably less public attention, despite carrying comparable or greater research-documented risk than alcohol specifically. Number 3 is social isolation, and it's one of the more under-recognized risks on this list. A large analysis following over 300,000 people found isolation associated with up to a 50% increased risk of earlier death, a magnitude some researchers have compared to the risk associated with regular smoking. Evidence level, strong, based on large observational data, though establishing direct causation is inherently difficult in this kind of research. Isolation appears to affect the body measurably. Elevated inflammation, weakened immune response, and higher blood pressure have all been documented in research on socially isolated individuals. Isolation doesn't necessarily mean living alone. It can mean lacking genuine, honest connection even while surrounded by people. The practical response doesn't require an overhaul of your social life. Research suggests even modest, consistent connection, regular contact with 1 or 2 genuinely trusted people, meaningfully reduces this risk. Men noticing persistent, significant isolation alongside low mood or loss of interest in previously valued activities should consider raising this with a doctor, since it may reflect a treatable underlying condition rather than simple circumstance. Number 2 ranks above stress and isolation specifically because of how directly and immediately it affects multiple body systems simultaneously. Research from sleep medicine consistently links men who regularly sleep fewer than 6 hours nightly to a meaningfully shorter average lifespan, with some studies estimating a reduction exceeding 7 years. The mechanism is broad. Insufficient sleep elevates resting heart rate, stiffens blood vessels, impairs blood sugar regulation, and measurably reduces immune function, even after a single night of significantly shortened sleep. Evidence level, strong, drawn from extensive sleep research and large cohort studies tracking sleep duration against health outcomes over years. What makes this particularly relevant is how quickly the body responds to correction. Several consecutive nights of adequate 7 to 8 hour sleep show measurable improvement in blood pressure, mood, and cognitive function in research. Practical steps include a consistent sleep and wake schedule, reduced screen exposure before bed, and limiting caffeine after early afternoon. Men experiencing persistent insomnia or loud snoring with breathing pauses should be evaluated for sleep apnea specifically, since this treatable condition frequently underlies otherwise unexplained poor sleep. Before continuing to the final point, if you want a broader framework connecting sleep, stress, and overall vitality after 40, Dr. Emily Carter's guide, The Iron Age, the complete blueprint to reclaiming testosterone strength vitality after 40, covers testosterone strength, energy, and vitality across 9 focus chapters in a concise 14-page format. It's priced at $49.99 with the link provided with this video. It's educational, not a replacement for medical care, but it offers a clear framework connecting these interrelated systems together. And now the habit ranking above all 4 already discussed, including alcohol, stress, isolation, and even sleep. Number 1 is prolonged sitting. A large study following over 120,000 people found men sitting more than 8 hours daily carried a 60% higher risk of earlier death, with sedentary lifestyle overall linked to a reduction in life expectancy of up to a decade in some analyses. Evidence level, strong, based on extensive research across multiple large populations. The mechanism centers on what happens to your largest muscles when they stop moving. Prolonged stillness causes blood to pool in the lower body, slows circulation, and after roughly 30 minutes without movement, measurably reduces metabolic activity while accelerating fat storage and muscle breakdown. What matters most isn't total daily sitting time alone, but how long you sit without interruption. Standing and moving for even 2 minutes every 30 minutes measurably interrupts this process, according to research. Walking after meals, taking calls standing, and choosing stairs when reasonable all provide meaningful, low-effort interruption to prolonged stillness throughout a normal day. Bringing these 5 together, alcohol's risk is dose-dependent and largely modifiable through moderation, rather than requiring elimination for most men. Chronic stress affects nearly every system in the body and responds to consistent, modest recovery practices rather than requiring stress elimination, which isn't realistic. Social isolation carries a risk magnitude comparable to smoking in some research and responds to even modest, genuine connection. Insufficient sleep affects the body rapidly and also improves rapidly with correction. Prolonged sitting carries the largest documented risk on this list and responds specifically to interrupting stillness regularly, not necessarily to total exercise volume alone. None of these 5 require dramatic, immediate life changes to begin addressing. They require consistent, modest adjustments sustained over time, which the research consistently shows produces measurable improvement across all 5 areas. It's worth addressing directly how these 5 factors rarely operate as isolated, unrelated risks in a real person's life, since research increasingly finds they cluster together rather than existing independently. A man dealing with chronic, unmanaged stress is statistically more likely to also report poor sleep, since elevated cortisol directly interferes with sleep architecture. Poor sleep, in turn, is associated with reduced motivation for physical activity the following day, contributing to the prolonged sitting discussed as the top risk on this list. And social isolation frequently compounds all of the above, since isolated men are less likely to have someone noticing and gently prompting change in any of these other areas. This clustering matters practically because it means addressing one habit often creates measurable improvement in the others without requiring 5 entirely separate interventions pursued in isolation. Research on behavior change consistently finds that improving sleep quality, for instance, frequently produces secondary improvement in stress management and physical activity levels, even without directly targeting those areas at all. This is precisely why choosing one habit from this list to address first rather than attempting to overhaul all 5 simultaneously tends to produce more sustainable, compounding results according to behavior change research. Several of the habits discussed throughout this video develop gradually enough that most men don't consciously register the change happening in real time. Sitting more each year as a career becomes more sedentary, sleep gradually shortening as responsibilities accumulate, stress becoming a persistent background hum rather than an occasional spike, social circles quietly narrowing after major life transitions like career changes, children leaving home, or the loss of a close friend or family member. None of these shifts typically arrive as a single, memorable moment. They accumulate slowly enough that a man often doesn't recognize how much his daily pattern has changed until a doctor's visit, a health scare, or a video like this one prompts him to actually compare his current routine against what it looked like a decade earlier. This is precisely why periodic, honest self-assessment matters considerably more than most men assume. Comparing your current sitting time, sleep duration, stress level, and social connection against where they stood 5 or 10 years ago often reveals a considerably clearer picture than trying to evaluate any single day in isolation, since gradual drift is exactly the kind of change that's hardest to notice without a genuine point of comparison. For men wanting a genuinely practical way to begin addressing these 5 factors without becoming overwhelmed by trying to fix everything simultaneously, research on sustainable behavior change points toward a sequential rather than simultaneous approach. Starting with sleep tends to be a particularly effective entry point given how directly and quickly it responds to correction and how much it influences the other 4 factors discussed throughout this video. Once sleep has stabilized over several weeks, layering in consistent movement to interrupt prolonged sitting tends to be a natural next step, since improved sleep typically restores some of the energy and motivation that sedentary patterns often erode over time. Stress management and social connection, the 2 remaining factors, tend to improve somewhat naturally as sleep and activity improve, though both benefit from direct, intentional attention as well, rather than being left entirely to chance as secondary effects of the other changes. Alcohol moderation, discussed as the 5th and final factor on this list specifically because it carries the smallest relative impact among the 5, is often easiest to address once the other 4 are already trending in a positive direction, since men frequently find their reliance on alcohol as a stress relief or sleep aid tool naturally decreases once healthier alternatives are already in place. It's worth directly addressing why alcohol receives disproportionate cultural attention compared to its actual measured impact on this list, since understanding this helps explain a broader pattern relevant to how health information circulates generally. Alcohol is a visible, easily discussed behavior consumed in social settings, regulated by clear guidelines, and frequently the subject of public health campaigns, all of which make it a natural focus for health messaging. The other 4 factors on this list, stress, isolation, sleep, and sitting, are considerably less visible and don't fit as neatly into a simple public health message, despite research consistently showing they carry equal or greater impact on longevity. This doesn't mean alcohol's risk should be dismissed, since the research behind it remains genuinely solid. It means the disproportionate cultural attention alcohol receives relative to its actual position on this list has likely caused many men to underestimate the other 4 factors considerably more significant to their overall health. A man who successfully moderates his drinking while continuing to sit for 10 hours daily, sleep 5 hours nightly, and remain socially isolated has addressed the smallest of the 5 risks discussed throughout this video, while leaving the 4 larger ones completely unaddressed. Building further on the alcohol discussion, it's worth explaining more precisely why the pattern of drinking matters as much as or more than the total amount consumed weekly. The liver's capacity to process alcohol operates at a relatively fixed rate, roughly 1 standard drink per hour, regardless of how quickly alcohol is actually consumed. When drinks are consumed faster than this processing rate allows, which is precisely what happens during binge drinking, blood alcohol concentration rises considerably higher than it would with the same total volume spread across a longer period, and liver cells are exposed to a more concentrated toxic burden during that window. This explains why research consistently finds that a man consuming the exact same weekly total of alcohol, but concentrated into 2 heavy nights rather than spread across 5 moderate ones, faces meaningfully different health outcomes despite identical total consumption. This distinction rarely makes it into general public health messaging, which tends to focus on weekly totals alone, but it represents a genuinely important, evidence-supported nuance worth understanding if you're specifically trying to reduce this particular risk without necessarily eliminating alcohol entirely. It's worth expanding further on the distinction between acute and chronic stress discussed earlier, since this distinction is frequently misunderstood in general health conversation. Acute stress, a genuine short-term challenge followed by resolution and recovery, triggers a cortisol response that is, in research terms, broadly protective and adaptive. It sharpens focus, mobilizes energy, and then resolves once the triggering situation passes, allowing the body to return to baseline. Chronic stress differs fundamentally, not simply in duration, but in the body's actual physiological response. When stress becomes a persistent background state rather than an occasional spike followed by recovery, cortisol remains elevated without the natural resolution acute stress allows. This sustained elevation is what drives the documented negative effects discussed earlier: immune suppression, elevated blood pressure, disrupted sleep, rather than stress itself being inherently harmful. This distinction matters practically, since it means the goal isn't eliminating stress entirely, which isn't realistic or even necessarily desirable, but rather ensuring that stress responses are followed by genuine periods of recovery rather than accumulating without resolution over weeks, months, or years. Research on stress recognition finds that men, on average, are somewhat less likely than women to consciously identify and label their own experience as stress, often instead noticing downstream physical symptoms, tension, fatigue, irritability, digestive issues, without connecting them back to an underlying chronic stress pattern. This connects to broader cultural conditioning around emotional expression discussed elsewhere in health research, where men are frequently socialized to minimize or push through discomfort rather than naming and addressing it directly. This matters considerably for the topic discussed throughout this video, since a man experiencing chronic stress without consciously recognizing it as such is unlikely to seek out the recovery practices, exercise, social connection, deliberate downtime that research shows genuinely help. Recognizing physical symptoms like persistent muscle tension, digestive discomfort, or unexplained fatigue as potential signals of underlying chronic stress, rather than assuming they reflect an entirely separate physical issue, represents a genuinely useful reframe for many men. It's worth expanding on why social isolation specifically becomes a growing risk for men as they age. A pattern research links to a few converging factors. Men, on average, tend to rely more heavily on a smaller number of close relationships, frequently centered around a spouse or partner, compared to women who research consistently finds maintain broader, more distributed social networks throughout life. This means the loss or strain of a single key relationship, through divorce, death of a spouse, or simply relationship difficulty, can leave a man considerably more isolated than an equivalent loss might leave a woman with a broader existing support network to draw from. Career-centered social connection also tends to diminish more significantly at retirement for men specifically, since workplace relationships frequently serve as a primary source of regular social contact throughout a man's working years, without an equivalent structure naturally replacing that connection afterward, unless deliberately built. Understanding these specific patterns helps explain why isolation risk doesn't simply appear randomly with age, but follows a somewhat predictable trajectory tied to specific life transitions common in men's lives, transitions worth anticipating and proactively addressing rather than only responding to after isolation has already become significant. For men who recognize isolation has become a genuine pattern in their own life, research on rebuilding social connection points toward a few practical, evidence-supported starting points. Structured activities, joining a group built around a shared interest, a sports league, a volunteer organization, a regular class, tend to produce more consistent, sustained connection than relying on spontaneous social effort alone, since the structure itself provides a reliable, recurring reason for contact without requiring ongoing individual initiative each time. Reconnecting with previously close relationships that have simply drifted due to time and distance, rather than exclusively pursuing entirely new relationships, also shows research support, since existing relational history often allows connection to rebuild more quickly than starting entirely from scratch. It's worth expanding on the sleep discussion specifically, since total duration alone doesn't capture the complete picture research has identified. Sleep quality, specifically the amount of time spent in deep, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, matters considerably alongside total hours, since these specific stages are when the body performs much of its physical repair and hormonal regulation, including the testosterone production discussed throughout other content on this channel. A man spending 8 hours in bed, but experiencing frequent brief awakenings, whether from sleep apnea, an uncomfortable sleep environment, or alcohol consumption disrupting sleep architecture, may show considerably poorer health markers than a man sleeping a slightly shorter but more consolidated 7 hours. This is precisely why addressing sleep quality, not simply extending time in bed, matters for capturing the full benefit research links to this factor, and why persistent poor sleep despite adequate time in bed specifically warrants medical evaluation rather than simply trying to sleep longer. Given how significant prolonged sitting appears in this research, it's worth addressing a common assumption directly, that simply switching to a standing desk fully resolves this risk. Research on standing desks specifically finds they reduce, but don't eliminate the risks associated with prolonged stillness, since standing motionless for extended periods carries its own separate set of circulatory concerns and doesn't provide the active movement that appears to be the more significant protective factor in the underlying research. This suggests the more accurate takeaway isn't simply sitting less in favor of standing more, but genuinely interrupting stillness with actual movement at regular intervals, regardless of whether the baseline position is sitting or standing. A man who stands motionless at a desk for 8 hours has addressed only part of the underlying mechanism this research describes, while a man who sits but stands and walks briefly every 30 minutes may be capturing more of the actual protective benefit the research points toward. Stepping back across everything discussed throughout this extended exploration of these 5 habits, a consistent theme emerges. In nearly every case, the research points toward regularity and interruption of harmful patterns mattering more than any single dramatic intervention. Consistent moderate alcohol patterns rather than occasional extremes. Regular stress recovery rather than eliminating stress entirely. Consistent, even modest, social connection rather than large but infrequent social effort. Consistent sleep quality rather than occasionally catching up on rest. And regular interruption of stillness rather than total exercise volume alone. This consistent pattern across seemingly unrelated health factors suggests something worth remembering broadly, that sustainable, moderate consistency tends to outperform dramatic, occasional effort across nearly every area of health research has examined. Since testosterone is a recurring theme across this channel, it's worth directly connecting each of these 5 factors back to hormonal health, specifically since the relationship isn't equal across all 5. Sleep carries the most direct, well-documented connection since the majority of daily testosterone release occurs during deep sleep cycles. Specifically, meaning chronic sleep restriction has an almost immediate measurable effect on hormone levels, sometimes within a single week of consistent restriction, according to research. Chronic stress affects testosterone through sustained cortisol elevation. Since cortisol and testosterone exist in a documented inverse relationship, elevated cortisol tends to suppress testosterone production over time. Prolonged sitting connects to testosterone somewhat indirectly, primarily through its association with weight gain and reduced insulin sensitivity, both of which independently affect hormonal balance. Social isolation carries a less direct hormonal connection but is linked in research to elevated stress markers generally, connecting back to the same cortisol pathway. Alcohol, particularly heavy or binge consumption, has the most directly documented acute effect on testosterone among lifestyle factors, given alcohol's well-established impact on liver function and hormone metabolism specifically. Research on comprehensive lifestyle intervention consistently finds that addressing multiple related factors together produces measurably better outcomes than optimizing any single factor in isolation, even when that single factor receives considerably more intensive individual attention. This helps explain why a man who dramatically improves his sleep alone while continuing to sit most of the day, remain chronically stressed, and stay socially isolated often sees more modest overall improvement than research would predict from sleep optimization alone, since the other 4 factors continue actively working against the very system sleep improvement is meant to support. This isn't intended to suggest all 5 factors require simultaneous perfect execution before any benefit appears, since sequential gradual improvement remains a genuinely reasonable and research-supported approach, as discussed earlier in this video. It's meant to explain why plateauing sometimes occurs even after genuine improvement in one area, and why continuing to address the remaining factors, even gradually, tends to unlock further improvement that addressing any single factor alone couldn't fully achieve on its own. It's worth acknowledging directly that individual response to each of these 5 factors varies considerably, shaped by genetics, baseline health, age, and other circumstances specific to each person. The research discussed throughout this video reflects population-level averages, genuinely useful for understanding broad patterns and directing attention toward habits most likely to matter, but not a precise prediction for any specific individual. 2 men with identical sitting time, sleep duration, and stress levels may experience meaningfully different health outcomes based on other factors entirely outside. This video's scope, genetics, existing medical conditions, diet quality, and other variables research continues to study. This variation doesn't undermine the practical value of the guidance discussed throughout this video. It simply means the goal isn't achieving some theoretical perfect score across all 5 factors, but rather making genuine, sustained improvement relative to your own starting point, which research consistently links to better outcomes regardless of where any individual begins. Stepping back from the specific mechanisms discussed throughout this video, it's worth reflecting briefly on why understanding this research genuinely matters beyond simple curiosity. Each of these 5 factors, unlike many health risks that feel entirely outside personal control, genuinely responds to modifiable behavior, meaning the research discussed throughout this video isn't simply describing an unavoidable risk profile, but identifying specific actionable levers available to nearly every man regardless of age, income, or circumstance. This distinguishes this particular topic from many other health risk factors that carry a significant genetic or circumstantial component largely outside individual control. Sleep, stress, isolation, sitting, and alcohol are, to a meaningful degree, factors within your own daily choices, which means the research discussed throughout this video represents something considerably more useful than a simple list of risks to worry about. It represents a genuinely practical roadmap toward measurable, evidence-supported improvement available to start today, regardless of where you're currently starting from. So here's the bottom line. These 5 habits don't operate in isolation. They compound, and addressing one often makes the others easier to address as well. Alcohol, sitting last on this list, still matters, but it's far from the most significant factor research identifies. 3 practical takeaways. Prioritize interrupting prolonged sitting throughout your day, since it carries the largest documented impact on this list. Treat consistent sleep as a foundational habit rather than something to sacrifice first when busy, and build genuine, even modest, social connection into your regular routine rather than treating it as optional. If any of these 5 felt familiar, that's worth reflecting on rather than dismissing. The Iron Age Guide is linked with this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.